Welcome to the Lockdown Economy, a social nonprofit initiative by the think tank AlterContacts to help small businesses and entrepreneurs overcome the challenges of the pandemic and reactivate the economy. I'm Mike Tierney, and today we're in Portland, Oregon, and we're speaking with Jill Kuehler. Jill is the founder and owner of Freeland Spirits, based in Portland, Oregon. It's a distillery. Jill, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
So my first question, just give us a breakdown, a little sharing of how your business came about, how many employees you started with, how many you have now, and what you do.
My background is all in food and agriculture. And I was running a nonprofit farm that taught kids where good food comes from in Portland for about 7 years. And I'd always wanted to start my own business, something connected to food. And I got to know my good friend. She's a rancher in Eastern Oregon. She raises grass-fed beef. And we always drink whiskey when she comes to town. So Corey and I were having one of our fateful whiskey nights. And I was like, this is a delicious whiskey, but I don't know where the grain comes from. I don't think of like the terroir with my whiskey the way I do wine. And she was like, well, I've always wanted to incorporate grain production on the ranch. If I'll grow it, if you make it. And that was kind of the birth of Freeland. And that was about probably 6 or 7 years ago. So I got really excited at that point for it to be a women-owned and operated venture. There's just so few women in distilling and just as few in ranching. So it was really exciting to highlight women in these places where you just haven't seen them that often. So I began my search for a female distiller, knowing there were only a handful in the world, but one happened to be in Bend, Oregon. Molly Troop has her master's in distilling from Scotland and was running production at a small distillery in Bend. And I went out and threw over my shoulder and drug her back to Portland. And we started making gin. And so we released our gin just over 3 years ago. And that was the birth of the business. And now we've got the gin and a bourbon. And we actually have a Geneva, which is a Dutch style. And we released a London dry gin. And we've also gone into the canned cocktail business as well. So that's where we are.
And so how much time between that fateful night when you're hanging out and you're sipping some whiskey, how much time between that night and when you open your doors?
It was about 3 years or 4 even. Yeah. Everything was just painfully slow. There was obviously a distillery is going to be a very capital intensive venture. So there was a lot of fundraising that had to be done, and just finding the space in Portland took over a year. Our beautiful still was an 18-month wait list. So every piece of it was painfully slow. So it was a true celebration to finally throw the doors open.
And so how many employees do you have now?
We started with me and Molly making gin, and then we slowly added, and once our tasting room was open, it was a full cocktail bar with food. And so we got up to about 15 employees. And then when we had to shut the tasting room down, we dropped to 6, and we've stayed at 6.
Right. And so that leads me right into my next question, which is, please talk to us about how the pandemic and the restrictions, how has that affected your business, and what are the steps you've taken to get through this and muddle through?
So it was terrifying, of course, because as a distillery, at least for us, about 40% of our sales were bars and restaurants. And then our own tasting room is a huge, being a young business, the tasting room is still a really big part of our business. We're only distributed on the West Coast in California and Washington. So we really rely on our tasting room and our bar and restaurant partners. So it was terrifying. But we really quickly, we got very creative really quick. And I think that was the key to our success. A lot of distilleries in the US started making hand sanitizer, and we were one, which was amazing as just to be able to help the community that way. It was also amazing for cash flow. We got big contracts with the city of Portland, the fire department, Providence Hospital, Wells Fargo, and just around the clock, where I had my daughter there putting on labels on hand sanitizer jugs. And it was just a very grassroots effort that helped a ton. And then even though our tasting room was closed, the state allowed for curbside pickup. So we very quickly pivoted and started doing, you could order online through our booze through, we'd package it up for you and have it ready to bring out to your car when you pulled into the parking lot. So that was, I would say, the best thing that we did. We quickly started making fresh juice mixers. So we've all spent hours just hand juicing lemons and limes, but we were able to put together cocktail kits. So novice people that normally go to a bar for a delicious cocktail could get the bottle, could get the mixer and go home and make a delicious cocktail at home.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is that in turn made our tasting room sales actually triple in 2020 versus what they had been before, with just 2 people working instead of 10. So I would say, all of our efforts to really be creative and pivot quick paid off for us.
So your tasting room was essentially in itself sort of a restaurant bar, right?
It was. Yeah,
And
it was.
so like many other restaurant bars, you had to close your doors and then figure out a curbside protocol. And it turned out that you doing that, incorporating the mixer kit and the cocktails that you were serving, like allowed you to increase your business over the year before in 2019.
Absolutely. Yeah, we
That's
ended
so
up
cool.
doubling over 2019. So
That's amazing.
it ended up being great. And, while we did lose all the bar and restaurant sales, retail really picked up. So we were able to make up a lot of the difference there too. We were able to focus on getting into some of the bigger chains. So I would say, not only did we like survive the pandemic, we actually thrived.
Hmm. That's good to hear. So, have you been in contact with other folks in your industry and been in contact with your customers and maybe other folks out there to find out how they're faring and get ideas from them and sharing?
We do a lot of sharing. I would say a lot of the craft distilling industry, if anybody was like, 100% of their sales were bars and restaurants, they're probably out of business now. Several have had to close their doors, mostly because they had a very narrow focus on one aspect of their business. They weren't diversified enough. But I would say a lot of them have done pretty well. At least maintained sales, and then some like us have done have done really well. So it's kind of all over the map, and a lot of it just depends on how willing you are and how able to totally throw plans out the window and try new things, and
Yeah.
yeah, be willing to risk.
Yeah. Be nimble, be ready for change, be ready to fail and start again on whatever ideas you come up with.
It's critical. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's just human nature to want to have a plan and to implement a plan and to think that things are predictable. But pandemic or no pandemic, things are never predictable. Whatever plan I set out in a year, all I can tell the staff is like, all we know is this plan isn't going to happen.
Mhm.
But not to say planning isn't important, but you have to be able to quickly throw the plan out the window and start over. So I think the pandemic only made that much more in your face, and it was forced, but I think you have to always run a business that way.
Yeah. And so, speaking of plans, what have you and your team decided, like over the next, say, 3 months, and then possibly 6 months, and then, your game plan for possibly trying to come out of this at some point soon? I think we're getting towards a point where we can see some sort of finish line over the coming months.
Yes, so we will be looking at getting back into bars and restaurants, opening our tasting room back up. I think we'll keep a lot of what we've been doing. We'll keep our fresh mix program. We'll keep focusing on the home customer. Luckily we've been able to, because we've been able to grow the tasting room, we do have a bigger direct consumer market that we didn't have before. So we really want to maintain that. Laws are changing here pretty quick. We're not able to ship out of state, but I could see that changing. So the e-commerce side is going to become a much bigger part of our business. Yeah, so that's the new developments.
I think I remember reading about there was some relief in the tax that beverages industry was had a reduction in the tax they were paying, but that was a temporary. Did they extend that, or did they formally make it the real regular tax rate? Do you know what I'm referring to? It's like,
The tasting room tax.
yeah, well, I thought it was the per proof gallon tax.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
federally, yes, that happened and it's been made permanent. So that's
Okay.
been reduced, which is super helpful for the craft distiller. And then there's statewide things that are happening too. Like in Oregon, we're trying to pass legislation to reduce our tasting room tax.
Mhm.
And we're actually hoping to open a second tasting room in Oregon if that goes through.
Wow. Do we have a location for that yet?
I'm looking in Lake Oswego.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So I can't wait. If I'm ever back in Portland, I'm gonna stop on by to
Wonderful.
the first one and the second one. All right. So can you name a couple of things that you, if you could raise your hand and say, "Hey, I need help with these things," what would they be?
Oh, good question. I mean, I would love, the fairy, the the glass ball that tells the future. Um, if I, yeah, a lot of what we need to do as a business is if we're going to grow, we're going to be getting out of state. And that's a lot of challenges with distribution. And so I always need help around navigating distribution, knowing how fast to grow, once things open back up, what will bars and restaurants look like? Will it be a return to the normal or will things look completely different? And how do I build a team around those needs? I think the team is so critical. It's such a tight knit team of 6 right now, and they're able to be creative and nimble. And as we grow, how do we maintain that sense of creativity and fun?
Mhm.
I think help around, this is, I don't know, something that's become really apparent to me over the pandemic. I feel like people have taken a real look at mental health in a new way. And I think the chance to slow down has been so good for so many of us, and a chance to reevaluate how we do business. And is the way that we assume like this is what's expected is actually, it gave a chance to just kind of like flip that on its head and to think of like what is really necessary. And if you kind of lead with like how is everyone actually well, and what fuels that, I think is so much is a real importance of looking at that we didn't put enough emphasis on before. And I hope we're all able to maintain that. I hope founders are able to look at mental health as a critical piece rather than just hard charging, go, like take a much more holistic approach. So I know I'm going to personally be looking for help around that, of how to just maintain, like, how do I not only look at the growth of the company but make sure we're all taking care of ourselves in that process.
Yeah, the balance factor is coming into play, and I
Right.
like that idea where you've said where uh, we might as well take this chaos that we've been forced and try to find an opportunity to recreate from scratch.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so, and that leads me to another question I have for you, which is, um, what do you think that the restrictions, the whole pandemic, and what it's done to your business, how has it pressed you into doing something that you normally wouldn't have done, that you did do, initiate or implement, that you recognize, hey, this is really good. I'm glad we did this.
I think it was scaling back. We had big plans of adding new states, and it was like, we have to just hone in, focus on Oregon, build the whole home market. And that, my nature is like, okay, this is a startup. We got to grow, we got to grow, which means wider, wider, wider. And in fact, there's a lot we could do. We could grow just within our own backyard. So that ended up being a real success, is the kind of just hone in, know your home market. And I think that'll keep serving us really well as we do now start to go like that.
Right. And Jill, final question. What have I forgotten to ask that you feel like we need to share with other entrepreneurs out there that are listening?
Yeah, I can't think of anything in particular. I think, this is every industry has been impacted by this in so many different ways. Some businesses have been able to thrive, some have just been completely destroyed. And I think it's just the humanity aspect of it, and we're all in this together. And how can we, reach across the industry lines and support each other, and maintain that empathy as we come out and look to rebuild.
Mhm. Yeah. So let's hold on to the empathy that we built as we're going through this together. See if
Right.
we can carry that through
Exactly.
past when we get through it.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Jill Kuehler, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thanks, Mike.
So Jill Kuehler from Freeland Spirits Distillery, Portland, Oregon. And I want to thank you. And I want to thank all of the folks tuning in. I recommend that you subscribe to our channel and share it with others in your network. We have a ton of stories and insights, best practice stories from business owners and entrepreneurs all over the globe, from big cities, small towns, all communities in between. And I'm Mike Tierney saying goodbye until next time. Stay tuned and stay healthy.